But look, it's really important to understand what was happening when the play was set and when the play was written, because a lot happened between 1912 and 1945 when the play was written, and 1946 when it was first performed. Within 2 years of the Burlings sitting down in their cosy, closed-off dining room, the First World War would start. You've also got the infamous sinking of the Titanic. There were strong distinctions between the upper and lower classes. Now, we've talked about that. Massive divide between the rich and the poor. But these class distinctions by 1946 had been greatly reduced as a result of 2 world wars. Now, if you're looking at the role of women, as we see all the way through the play with Eva Smith, even Mrs. Burling and Sheila, were subservient to men. In other words, they were there simply to facilitate a man's world, to assist the men, but to stay out of their way and to do as they were told. All a well-off woman could do was get married. A poor woman was seen as cheap labour. And if you think about the 2 characters in the book that represents, you've got Mrs. Burling, who obviously married Mr. Burling. You've got Sheila, who's about to marry Gerald. And you've got the poor woman, the poor and destitute and downtrodden Eva Smith, who was seen as cheap labour before Mr. Burling fired her. Okay. But this was about to change. By 1946, women had earned a much more valued place in society. And I'll come on to that a little bit later on. So I won't read any more of that out. I think it's self-explanatory, but you can obviously refer to this as many times as you want. Okay. Priestley deliberately set his play in 1912 because the date represented an era when all was very different from the time he was writing. It goes without saying that that is a very important point. In 1912, rigid class and gender boundaries seemed to ensure that nothing would change. Yet by 1945, most of those class and gender divisions had been breached. Priestley wanted to make the most of these changes. Through this play, he encouraged people to seize the opportunity the end of the war had given them to build a better, more caring society. So a really lovely overview there for you. Again, you can read through this in your own time, but please note that the play is set in Edwardian England. Now, this was very much an environment where there was an emerging middle class, but the upper class had very much stayed the same since Victorian times. Nothing changed. They inherited their money, they stayed within their own social circles and stuff everybody else. Okay? It's not our problem. That's the idea that underpins the play. And this was a time of strikes, food shortages and political tension. And the play's moral message: we should think of others, work together and be treated equally. Okay? Just a little note that the town of Brumley is not a real town, but it's supposed to be representative of the typical town where Priestley was born. He was born in a place called Bradford. And Bradford had many factories owned by rich people who paid very little for back-breaking work. Does that sound familiar? Now, as a socialist, this is a bit close to my heart. So, at the time of 1912, with the capitalists in control, people like Mr. Burling, England had no welfare system. So that means that if you were unlucky enough to not be able to get a job, there was nothing the government could do about it. You're on your own. You would starve to death. For those lucky enough to be employed, there were no unions, so nobody to stand up for the worker. And there were no laws that helped and protected people at work. And there was no minimum wage. So the average number of hours worked was up to 65. So we only work around 39, and for some people it's a lot less than that. And employers can basically treat their workers as they wanted. And we can see this with Mr. Burling in Inspector Calls. He refuses to give the women even a modest wage increase because he doesn't have to. Why should he? Okay? Okay, so we move on to a section that is particularly significant to your essay. We're looking at gender. A few obvious things to make. Even women like Mrs. Burling and Sheila, even though they come from wealthy and powerful families, they still had fewer rights than men at the time. They hadn't yet won the right to vote. They were not expected to work unless they were at the lower class. So we see Mrs. Burling, she does nothing. In fact, to ease her boredom, she becomes a member of the Brumley Women's Charity group. Just as a way of perhaps easing her boredom in what must be an incredibly mundane and pointless existence. The lower class women would have to work to survive. Look at the difference, the divide between the upper class and the lower class. They were seen as cheap labour. The higher class women were simply expected to marry. And so that divides women into two categories, doesn't it? The women that were simply expected to marry and do their duty by their husbands, get married, have children, continue the family line, and the women who were thought of as simply cheap labour, the women who were disposable, the women who weren't even considered by these wealthy members of society. The eldest male of any home would be the breadwinner and also be the person in charge at home. Their word was law. Now, this sounds suspiciously like Mrs. Burling, doesn't it? Listen to your father, Sheila, and you'll have to get used to Gerald not being away. Gerald being away. So, and Mrs. Burling is perfectly happy with this. Sheila becomes less so as the play goes on. A wife or daughter would never argue or answer back to their husband or their eldest son. Women were subservient to men. Now, just as a way of illustrating this startling divide in Edwardian society between the rich and the poor, 87% of all the money in England belonged to only 5% of the population. So that gives you just an indication of how rich the rich were, but perhaps even more significantly, how poor the poor were. It gives us an indication of the levels of desperation that Eva Smith would have experienced when she lost her job, not once, but twice. This desperation which led to her becoming a prostitute. Now again, this should sound familiar. The upper classes believed that there was no need to change anything about the way the capitalists ran the country. So we see this with Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling, and unfortunately even Eric, who should be one of the younger members of society that knows better. Mrs. Burling and Mr. Burling, they don't want anything to change. They believe that they're perfectly entitled to stay rich, the rich get richer, and the poor can sort themselves out. That's the mentality that Priestley absolutely despises, and that's the mentality that he's desperately trying to get away from in An Inspector Calls. Okay, now just to emphasise my point about what Priestley really thought about men like Mr. Burling, I found a fantastic quote here. Now, please bear in mind that in the play, the inspector is firm but fair with every character. But Burling in particular, he gets incredibly frustrated with and wound up with, and at one point actually shouts at Burling. Now, this is what Priestley said about people like Burling, people who were members of the upwardly mobile middle class, up here. The writer J.B. Priestley characterised the upwardly mobile middle class as narrow, suspicious, carping, mean souls. It lived in the fear of sliding back into the jungles and bogs of the workers. It had achieved respectability and was terrified of losing it. As a result, the lower middle class was often quite reactionary. Now, doesn't this sound exactly like Burling to you? Somebody who has dragged himself up and has achieved a degree of respectability and has achieved a degree of wealth and is incredibly scared of anything jeopardising that position. He's obsessed in the play of there being a public scandal. It's never, oh my God, we've killed this poor woman. It's always, think of the scandal. What happens if this gets out in the papers? What's going to happen to my knighthood? So this is a very, very important quotation from Priestley. And again, this is all context. Lived in fear of sliding back into the jungles and bogs of the workers. And we see this insecurity in Burling. We see this fear. He's unable to hide his working class roots. He's unable to hide his regional dialect. Now, I will let you read this little bit at the bottom of the page, but this deals with the women's suffragette movement, and I think it's fairly self-explanatory. But just to note, the women did not get the vote fully until the Representation of the People Act in